Week 13, Part 2, 25.1, Making Moves. Moves and codes and more. We started to play with the concepts of moves and codes. To better understand what we are doing when we move, let's take a closer look at how moves employ and engage codes, and how both work together to allow us to move between spaces and navigate the coded communications in each. Codes. Code switching is a concept from linguistics that, in its strictest interpretation, means using multiple languages or dialects in conversation. When we use the term code in our context, we draw from semiotics and semantics. Codes, in this context, transfer meaning through language and make messages understandable to audiences. They are the cultural connotations within all language and all communications. Switching is more than tailoring to a specific audience. Dressing for an interview or not cursing in front of your parents is basic awareness of audience and situation. When we talk about code switching, we mean understanding the connotations and conventions of communication within a space and shifting use of language in order to be understood. So instead of simply knowing not to include the text speak you use with your friends in your academic papers, code switching would require you to understand the subtleties of academic discourse and know how to include those coded conventions in your academic papers as well. Some spaces require a strict switch in the languages you use, and other spaces allow for a meshing of codes. To some degree, meshing requires both parties to be fluent in both languages. Swales, for instance, identified as a bird-watching Whovian. If we assume that there is a language associated with each of these groups and that the language includes coded meanings, two bird-watching Whovians could mesh their communications and identities in ways that would be meaningless to most. Within these linguistic identities is where we find our interest in the switching and meshing of language. In Project 1, we recognize that literacy, in many ways, constructs us and our identities. In Project 2, we recognize that our interaction with others creates shared literacies and allows us to connect through language. In Project 3, our goal is to see these aspects of our identity as they manifest through language, which, in essence, allows our writing to serve as a representation of our identities. Visualizing our different selves in different spaces is easy. Imagine the Dolly Parton challenge. What 4 spaces would you pick, and what 4 images would you select? How we present ourselves across spaces includes the language we use, as well as how we use it and with whom. In addition to a picture, think of terms or tones you use and how you tailor them to the space, audience, and intention of the communication. Simply thinking through different spaces where you communicate can help you start to see how you use language intentionally in each space and begin to locate your identities as demonstrated through writing. With those spaces in mind, you can also look for and at the codes you use and how you switch between audiences to establish meaning through those codes. Remember that codes are simply elements within the language that represent meaning. When you look for codes, you can think of terms, tones, turns, tricks, or traits that you use within specific settings or spaces. While some codes, like the use of specific terms and the contextual connections and allusions, can exist in some form in all languages, specific codes are only truly known to the members who speak the language and know the culture. By evaluating the texts you created across spaces, you will be able to see the moves you make to construct your identity and communicate through writing within each space. When you look for code switching in your writing, then know that you may not be an expert in the language you speak, but you are fluent, and you know that there is meaning to be found in the lines you wrote and between them. Those meanings and your use of the codes that transmit them are what you want to find by evaluating your texts and sharing with your peers and your instructor. Moves. Code switching and meshing allows speakers and writers to move between worlds. Rhetorical moves, on the other hand, designate these speakers as clearly situated within one world and conversant, agile even, within one language and culture. If codes give language contextualized meaning, moves play to audience by emphasizing conventions through the utilization of codes. In other words, codes are the meanings behind the language, and moves are the choices to use codes. To make the moves, you need to know the codes. Both Self from Project 1 and Swales from Project 2 studied rhetorical moves in academic writing and found that as writers within an academic discourse community, we make moves to show that we understand the conventions and literacy practices of a specific academic genre. These moves are markers that distinguish our place within the discourse community by proving that we can and will follow and fulfill the expectations of membership. Self and Swales note moves like establishing the field, locating your work and yourself within the space, defining a need for your work, and sharing your work. The rhetorical moves Swales and Self locate within the academic discourse community transfer to writing in other discourse communities. When we looked at a discourse community in Project 2, we located concrete elements, such as using specific terms within a lexis, that establish a writer's place within the communications of the discourse community. But the rhetorical moves also shift with situation. Just as discourse communities establish and enact their own literacy practices, studies on the spaces where discourse communities communicate show that specific moves are developed and deployed within these specific spaces too. Research on fan fiction shows that young, underrepresented minority writers make rhetorical moves that often flip, disrupt, and subvert standard narrative models. The moves are specific to the community and space, so it can be difficult to understand the meanings out of context, which helps keep outsiders outside. While shipping might be a standard trope from literature to a rom-com, flipping a ship as a power move is distinct to specific spaces and builds on specific shared stories. Like dialects within a language, discourse communities often include subgroups that communicate within a specific space. For instance, fan fiction can exist in a space like an archive of our own, and within these spaces, different universes are built from different fan communities. Some moves exist beyond these specific spaces, some cross communities within these spaces, and some are localized. When we write within discourse communities and within spaces, we make moves. When you wrote Projects 1 and 2, you made moves to fit within the genre and the larger academic discourse community. Making moves includes using literacy practices we located within our discourse community and utilizing the terms associated with assignment, audience, and genre. When you look at your writing, what moves do you see? Looking for textual moves feels different, but it is built on the same close and critical reading you apply to culture every day. You know the term moves, and you know when you are making them or when they are being made. The concept of making moves may have a different denotation in academic discourse, but the term and the concept exist within popular language. When Cardi makes money moves, she's playing on moves to reference the dance moves that initially made her money, but she's really talking about moves as the financial choices she made to earn and grow her money into substantial wealth. Her moves, the choices that help her get what she wants, are not unlike the moves we make to be understood. You might have learned about the rhetorical appeal ethos. When you read an author's writing or you listen to a speaker, you look for ethos. When you meet a new person or have a professional exchange, you watch for ethos. But when you are the writer or speaker, you need to know how to read the situation and write or speak to establish your ethos. You can establish ethos, your credibility, through making moves and navigating codes. What moves does Cardi make to establish that she is authentic within the community she represents? If she makes a linguistic move by using a coded term that only members of the discourse community she is communicating with understand, the move might not be understood by an outsider who is not fluent with the language or culture she is speaking. But if you understand moves and listen to what people say, read what they write, and watch how the communication connects with other people in the community and culture, you can see that moves are moves. You can probably also tell when someone appropriates elements that aren't authentic. When some people listen to punk, they hear noise and think it's meaningless. Other people hear the anger of individuals who want to express themselves but didn't go to Juilliard, and they may not get the message, but they get that there is a message. Other people hear the stories of individuals who had experiences like their own experiences, and they get it because they are it and it is them. It speaks to and for them. You don't have to get the move to get that there are moves. Your moves and our codes. Now that we have looked at how language is coded and how moves are made to use coded language to communicate with specific audiences in specific spaces, we will read Writing in Search for Moves and Codes, which is what we are calling textual evaluation. Over the semester, you have learned codes of academic discourse and practiced making moves. Now you will practice reading texts for codes and moves. Where better to start than with a writer you know well, you. You will look at 3 texts you constructed for 3 situations with different audiences in different spaces. You know at least some codes in each space, and you know how to make general moves and maybe even some specific moves within specific spaces. As you read the text, look for codes and terms by thinking of why you did what you did and how what you did communicated within that situation. An easy place to start is by looking at your academic writing from this term. You know some of the general academic moves and codes, and you had to use them in Project 1 and Project 2. In both, you established yourself as a member of the academic community by using MLA and included the tone of formal academic writing. Do you see any other ways you situated yourself within the academic discourse community in either project? What words did you include or exclude to express your academic identity? How did you demonstrate formal tone? What rhetorical moves did you make to appeal to your peers and your instructor? Were there any other public, perhaps, audiences you took into consideration? What about the tasks you posted that were read by your peers? How did you switch to shift across audiences, and do you see any specific moves you made within a space to appeal to that group that you didn't make or made differently in another space? Within each of our 2 projects, you also had specific expectations that would allow you to employ the language of the genre and make moves in response. For instance, the goal of the literacy narrative was to tell a good story about a personal connection. While you were writing within the larger academic discourse community, you were also writing to your peers, your instructor, and yourself. What moves did you make to tell a good story? Did you use concrete storytelling moves to build to the climax and connect the beginning and end? If you told the same story in your dorm to a group of friends, what would you add or delete, and how would you change how you told the story? What if you recounted the story to someone who was in the story? What if you had to tweet the story? How would you make a meme of the story? While you would be telling the same story but shifting for audience, you would also use language and elements of language differently to convey the meaning in different spaces and for different groups of individuals. What about the writing you've done for other courses this term? How have you tailored it by discipline or for the peers and instructor and genre and assignment? Has the writing in other courses been public? Have you felt more comfortable in some spaces and sections than in others? Also look at writing you created in and for other spaces and evaluate the texts for moves and codes. Select a total of 3 short texts or pieces of text that you have read closely to identify moves and codes. You can use any academic writing from class or from your exploration of discourse communities, as well as anything from any of your other communications that work as a sample to share with your peers and instructors. Because moves, like literacy practices, can be generated or modified within a space to fit the needs and the members, be sure not to limit yourself to discussing established or traditional moves. Instead, feel free to explore anything you recognize as a purposeful appeal. You will be able to explain the moves you recognize in your text because you made them. If you want to start by looking for concrete examples, here are a few broad examples of places where you may make moves. Hyperbole, metaphor for exaggeration, every. Voice or tone can be linguistic use of voice or inclusion of terms that express tone. Humor, tailored to audience and situation. Allusions, referencing outside information the reader knows to make a connection. Jargon, dropping terms, names, or content to establish credibility. Code glossing, restating a point, in particular. Concession, acknowledging the point being made, of course. Countering, offering a counterpoint to a point, particularly a concession, however. Hedging, limiting or qualifying a statement, may. Booster, terms to demonstrate certainty or confidence, clearly. Use hyperbole as an example. What would your best friend do if you texted, FML, I'm going to set my dorm on fire? And how would your instructor respond if you emailed the same line? The choice to send one and not the other is a move, a smart move. But again, don't feel limited. Even if you don't have a specific term to describe what you did, tell us. Starting with evaluating what you did to make your literacy narrative fulfill the expectations and conventions of the academic discourse community and what you added or removed for a public audience is a useful way to begin your exploration. What you discuss can just be examples of using a move for one audience and does not need to include a switch. But looking at places where you switch from one identity, your social self, for instance, to another, your academic self, can be a helpful way to locate your moves, which can lead you to coded concepts and terms you've engaged. You are looking at your writing for your moves in your spaces. Writing is a tool you use to explore and express and create yourself. There is no doubt that you are making moves and using codes to establish yourself within and across spaces. Project 3 is intended to allow you to reflect on your linguistic identity by applying the concepts of code switching and meshing and rhetorical moves in order to perform a textual evaluation of your own writing. In addition to learning to value your own language and use of language, learning from your peers will allow you to see that they are making purposeful choices to establish their communities and communicate their linguistic identities too. Assignment 25.1. After completing the reading, write a few concise and considered sentences in response to each of the following. Number 1. What is your understanding of code switching and code meshing? Number 2. Describe your understanding of moves. Number 3. Think of the role you play as an audience within a space. Discuss how you interpret the moves of the text you read. How can you tell if texts are tailored to you and for you as an audience? Number 4. Think of one specific example of a move you have made to respond to a specific audience within a specific space. State what you wrote, how it fit the space, and how it was tailored for the audience. Number 5. Then think of the identity you inhabit in a specific space. Describe how you use language to communicate that identity. Paste or describe an image, real or not, that represents that identity.